Hi, I'm George Mueller, and this is an online lecture intended to go with a History 101 class. This is intended to go with Chapter 1. There's going to be a brief video on Mesopotamia and prehistory in general, and then a separate video on Egypt. I need to make a note about chronology and some of the purposes of this class before we go on. This class isn't really intended to attack anyone's religious beliefs, but it is based on the best understanding that is widely believed through the academic world. So it assumes a couple of things. One of them is evolution. As far as we can tell, that's the best scientific understanding we have for the origin of mankind. So we're going to move ahead assuming that that's correct. Now, if that doesn't mesh with your personal beliefs, that's fine. But you should understand the belief whether or not it fits with your personal religious perspective. So, that said, also, it's not a major part of this class, just sets some of the background. So that said, we have a very long period of prehistory where humans and hominids were moving throughout Africa, probably, and definitely were developing, going back as far as 5 million years. As time goes on, you get hominids that are more and more like modern humans, from Neanderthals, who are very similar to modern humans. In fact, there's a good chance you have some of their DNA. All the way up to Homo sapiens sapiens, that is modern humans. And they first, well, as far as we know, they first appeared on Earth about 200,000 years ago. Now, before history refers to the time before writing. That's literally prehistory. And it's not necessarily before writing was developed. It's before writing that we can read was developed and writing that we have today. There's definitely older writing out there. We have not found the first writing. And every few years, we find something that pushes back the first date of writing. And it also needs to be said, we don't know where writing first developed. It appeared in a very similar time frame in several places throughout the world. China, India, and the Middle East. Mesopotamia in particular. But Egypt was right in there too. And there's no really convenient explanation for why it all appeared in such a short time frame. You're talking hundreds of thousands of years, and then within a few thousand years, writing is widely spread. It's one of the mysteries of ancient history. Whatever the case, the Old Stone Age, from about 2.5 million years ago to 10,000 years ago, was a period where, as far as we can tell, people moved around hunting and gathering food from the nature. People seem to have lived in nomadic bands of 20 to 30 individuals, and they didn't live in one set place. They traveled following game and the availability of food. There does seem to have been a division of labor between men and women. And about 500,000 BCE, fire was developed to a point where it could be used as a source of light, a source of heat, cooking food, which allows you to get more nutrients out of it. Yeah, I know. There's the raw food movement today. But in the ancient world, getting every bit of nutrition out of the food that was possible was important. And then somewhere around 10,000 years ago, there's an agricultural revolution. People began moving from hunting and gathering towards systematic growing of food. This was a very long process, partly because it involves selectively breeding plants to make them better food sources. Truly ancient food was remarkably inefficient in terms of providing nutrition. Nothing you eat today is how it appeared in nature at all. And one of the consequences of this Neolithic agricultural revolution is that people began to settle in one permanent place. And once you do that, you're cut off from some supplies, so trade begins to develop. Labor begins to be divided up amongst people. People specialize in doing one or two specific tasks. Tools are improved. Animals were domesticated. Writing was developed. And eventually, the use of metal, including copper plus tin to make bronze, develops. And by 3000 BC, you have the Bronze Age, where the use of bronze as to make tools and weapons spreads throughout the world. And speaking of spreading throughout the world, it should be noted, our best evidence indicates that humans developed in Africa. Probably. The Chinese don't agree. They claim that humans developed in Asia. And every few years they get a good piece of evidence. And what's happening is we're pushing back that veil and seeing that people spread out much more quickly than ever was believed before. In fact, this particular slide with this very simple spreading of humanity is wrong. And we can be certain from both genetic evidence and new archaeological finds. And by new, I mean as recently as February. But we do get to the period of history starting about 3500 BCE. And by the way, when we say BC or BCE, BC is an older term. It means before Christ. That's before the nominal year when theoretically the deity of Christianity was born. Except it's 33 years off of even that, so it doesn't quite work. Today, a more common term is BCE. It means before Common Era. And the bigger the number, the further back in time. So, as you can see, we get a very long time frame for these early civilizations. And from here, I want to point out that we're going to be moving into Mesopotamia, specifically, right where my pointer is right now. Here's a more close-up map. Mesopotamia is a very interesting place geologically and geographically. There's two rivers and a valley between them, surrounded by, well, on one side hills, and on the other side a desert that was very hard for ancient peoples to get through. Even today, it's a realm for adventurers in jeeps. And civilizations arose in Iraq between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers around 3500 to 3000 BCE. One question has always been why. An older explanation was something called the hydraulic theory of civilization. And it says, once you begin raising crops, if you're in a dry area where you have to get your water from a river and not from rainfall, you're forced to cooperate with your neighbors to build complicated systems of irrigation. And civilization really arises to support irrigation. This has been challenged a lot, but it's never quite been disproven. Now, the Sumerians had a style of writing called cuneiform. We can read cuneiform. And it's essentially taking clay tablets, smash them out flat, and then use a reed stylus to push into the tablets. And it starts off as a way to keep track of goods. Count up how much grain you have, how many cows. Now, one of the odd things about this is they used clay because that's what they had readily available. And this also creates a strange thing. This is the only civilization in history where historians cheer when somebody sets fire to a library. Because when you set fire to a clay tablet, you bake it, make it rock hard and permanent. So we have a lot of writing from the Sumerians. Sumerian culture seems to have moved from an oligarchy, that is, a rule by the elite few, towards monarchies and eventually empires. The most most well-known single emperor is Gilgamesh of Uruk, and I'll talk a little bit more about him in a second. Their also most famous artwork is the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the first stories that is really available to us. Sargon the Great is an interesting character. He was an Akkadian, and around 2340 BCE, he was serving as a mercenary, working for the Sumerians, for a particular city-state, and, well, he was a really good mercenary. And he took over and made himself ruler, first of that city-state and then others. Now, Sargon didn't force the Sumerians to abandon their culture. In fact, he forced the Akkadians to adopt the Sumerian culture. There were far fewer Akkadians than there were Sumerians, so they practiced assimilation, married into the larger group, and made many traditional concessions to traditional Sumerian sensibilities. For example, Sargon means legitimate king in Sumerian. It's not even his original name. And it's a pretty good piece of politics. It's hard to complain about a guy named legitimate king. What are you going to say? I don't like legitimate king. He's illegitimate? Yeah. So his very name was intended to help push this. He also adopted Sumerian religion. His daughter became a priestess of the moon goddess. So he dominated trade, made trade more efficient, and many city-states surrendered to him relatively easily. Now, that's backed up by the fact that he had a professional military, which was not the standard at that time. Generally, you had nobles who would lead basically untrained groups of peasants. So his professional military were better soldiers. But no empire lasts forever, and no man lives forever. By 2000 BCE, another border group really became important in the area. These were the Amorites, another group from outside of Sumeria proper. They moved in, worked as mercenaries again, and wound up ruling Sumeria and Mesopotamia in general. They took up Sumerian culture, and they're really famous for one particular leader, who's really famous for one thing. His name was Hammurabi, and Hammurabi set down his law code. It's definitely not the first law code in history, but it is the first law code that we have in detail. And it was made available to everyone by putting it on a stela, a sculptural piece that was available in the center of the city. So all citizens could, if they could read, or if they could find someone to read it to them, see the law. And you're going to read part of this in a document exercise. Now, Sumerian religion deserves some mention. Sumerian religion was polytheistic. It had a multitude of gods. And most Sumerian gods had a very human form and were very human-like. They had emotions. They flew into rages. They were sad. And many of them are associated with natural forces. And the idea of Sumerian religion was that you made sacrifices to keep the gods happy. And Sumerian religion is overtly pessimistic. A part of this has to do with a quirk of geography. The water in the rivers in Mesopotamia is very slightly saline. And over time, as you irrigate fields with it, the water evaporates and leaves behind a small amount of salt. Over centuries, that builds up and kills permanently that ground, makes it useless for agriculture. Sumerian fields cannot be planted in today in 2018. So old Sumerian cities are surrounded by wastelands. And Sumeria lasted long enough that the various city-states saw this happening, and it gave the Sumerians a very pessimistic feeling that the world was slowly running down and being destroyed. The Sumerian creation epic is called Enuma Elish. It's the story of gods of order who triumphed over the forces of chaos. If you play video games or tabletop war games, you might have seen some of these elements in things. The Sumerians also had a form of literature known as wisdom literature. These are stories that are intended to teach a point. And they're very similar to stories that appear in much later civilizations, like the stories of the parables in the Bible. One of the best known stories from the Sumerians is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's an epic story that tells about the king of Uruk's painful growth from an arrogant youth to maturity. Its themes are ones of friendship, loss, and the inevitability of death. And it's still a very powerful story even today. If you take a literature course, you will probably wind up reading this. The Mesopotamian sculptors were sophisticated, but their style is very alien looking. Rather than trying to exactly replicate reality, they tried to create symbols of power and emotion. Typically, the head and face were very detailed, but the body was neglected. Here's some examples. Children were often frequently portrayed as being very small adults, not really looking like children. Another common form of Mesopotamian art is the cylinder seal. These were cylinders made of baked clay that were hardened, and they had a story or a name on them, and you would roll them on a clay tablet, and it would leave behind your name. These are millions of these are still exist. They can be found all over the Middle East. In fact, there's so many of them that they aren't considered controlled artifacts, meaning you can just buy them. Another thing that's famous about Sumerian culture are ziggurats. The Sumerian ziggurat looked externally a lot like an Egyptian pyramid, but in reality, they were quite different. They served a different purpose, they were in a different location, and they were constructed using entirely different methods. This is the ziggurat of Ur, which is being currently restored. So this is how it looked a few years ago. It's even better today, although I've had some students who were back from serving in Iraq in the military, and they said there's people selling soda all around it. So it's a little less picturesque right now. One of the things about this is these are made of mud bricks, not stone. So if they're not carefully maintained, they will very much degrade over time. And yeah, they're not quite the same as a pyramid. And this large structure with a roughly pyramid shape does seem to be a thing that all human cultures do when they're at a certain level of technical progress. But I'll talk more about pyramids in the next video. So this is where I'm going to let you go. And there's a lot more about Sumeria that you can learn from the textbook. So take a look there.